Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk with the people who design, plan, build, develop, or even just think about how to create beautiful, successful, and humane cities and towns. Let's learn from each other and create places we truly care about. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. I've got my man Jason Segedy here on the program again. Jason, it's good to see you, although last time it was a lot more fun when we were having a beer in Akron.
It is good to see you again. And I remember it was a beautiful spring day. We were drinking some beer, and now where both of us are, it's cold and snowy.
Yeah, I know it's winter, but that's it's okay. It's just part of the seasons. I'm a 4-season kind of person. I enjoy the 4 seasons. It's just winter I wish were a touch shorter, but really it's fine. So
me too. I'm a Midwesterner. You can't take it out of my blood.
Yeah. And I was trying to make the point to my wife the other day. The thing is, I actually want it to get really cold for the next month, because then you just appreciate the warmer weather so much more when that happens. So
absolutely.
That's these things that we have to convince ourselves of. So
yep. April's only a couple months away.
Yeah. Well, Jason, there's a few things that have changed in your life since the last time we talked. I think the last time we got together, you were working for the university in Akron. And I wonder if you want to start by kind of talking about, I've got a bunch of stuff to kind of go through, and including you've had some interesting and provocative posts on LinkedIn lately, but I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what's new in your world and in Northeast Ohio.
Yeah, that's correct, Kevin. Last time we spoke, I was working as a project manager in the office of the president at the University of Akron. And since that time, I'm currently serving as the deputy director of administration for the city of North Canton. So that's essentially the assistant city manager. North Canton is an inner ring suburb of Canton, Ohio, about 17,000 people. Its claim to fame is it is the former home of the Hoover Company, which once manufactured about half of the vacuum cleaners on Earth. And a lot of North Canton's identity revolves around that company and its legacy. And so it's been kind of a neat transition for me, and listeners might remember I worked for the city of Akron for quite a long time, which is a mid-sized city, but much larger than North Canton. And it's been kind of neat just seeing the difference in scale and working for a smaller city. So it's been a great experience for me.
So Canton obviously is where the Pro Football Hall of Fame is. So North Canton's just outside, I guess, just right on the edge.
Correct. Yes. Canton, that's correct. Canton is the home of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. North Canton is immediately adjacent to Canton. And I'm still living here in Akron. So it's about a 23-mile drive for me. I think like we've discussed before, one cool thing about Northeast Ohio is we have all these cities stacked like those Russian dolls, Cleveland, Akron, and Canton, all within commuting range of each other. So, we don't have a whole lot of traffic compared to what you see in Atlanta or DC or a lot of other larger growing places. So it's not too bad of a drive.
So tell me a little bit about then what your day-to-day entails as the deputy administrator.
So my day-to-day, and this has been kind of also a neat transition from focusing on planning, because the thing I really like about my job is I continue to get to do planning and economic development. But in addition to that, I'm involved with assisting the director of administration on managing all the city's departments. So we oversee police, fire, our water distribution, and our water treatment plant, as well as like our streets and sewers and engineering and building permits and all of the other city departments. So it's been great to kind of get more hands-on with some of that management work. When I was planning director for Akron, I had a lot of interaction and with the people that were in charge of those functions for the city of Akron. But in this role, I have a more direct role in helping to manage it. So that's been really both a good learning experience as well as just giving me a better appreciation for the guys that are out plowing snow every day and making sure our water continues to come out of the faucet when you turn the tap and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting transition from the world of planning to more direct overall city management. Does give you a bit of a different picture on everything.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So what's the context here a little bit again? So you talked about you've got sort of like Cleveland, Akron, Canton that are sort of all stacked together. As a sort of a super region, is that super region growing? Is it changing? And then specifically like to North Canton, and Canton itself, is what's going on in terms of, I ask this because we've talked a lot about like growth and population growth and those sorts of issues in the past. And I wonder what specifically is going on there.
Yeah, so that larger Cleveland, Akron, Canton region has over 3 million people. The way I would define it is it's around 9 counties, depending on how you count them. It is slowly losing population. So the central cities continue to lose population, I think at a slowing rate from kind of like, say, the last 50 years, the rate of population loss in Cleveland, Akron, and Canton themselves has definitely slowed, but it's still not really counteracted by suburban growth because we really haven't had a lot of in-migration. And like everywhere in the U.S., the population's getting older. So, we're continuing to lose population as a region, but at a relatively slow rate now. As far as Canton and North Canton are concerned, so Canton is a lot like, I would say similar to the trajectory, although a little less severe negative population growth to like a place like Flint. Canton was a big manufacturing center, especially in the steel industry, a lot of specialty steel. So the Timken Company and Republic Steel were two of the big steel manufacturers in Canton. Canton was also known as the home of Diebold, which is ironically now in North Canton, which manufactures ATM machines and a lot of banking equipment, point of sale equipment for grocers and so forth. They're actually doing really well. And then in North Canton, we had Hoover. And so one thing that's kind of interesting about North Canton is it is an inner ring suburb, but it is kind of a place in its own right. It has its own town center, kind of has its own identity. It shares maybe a little bit of a Rust Belt legacy in terms of having a big manufacturer that closed down, but it's also a very attractive suburb with a really strong housing market. So, you get a little feel for the legacy of industrial decline, but at the same time, the community is growing, although at a pretty slow pace because we're pretty built out. We're only 6 square miles, and most of that land is spoken for. But the population is slowly growing and is a strong housing market, which is definitely a change from what I was used to in Akron, which is a housing market that needs a lot of help.
Yeah. Yeah. So then as a community, from like a leadership standpoint, et cetera, what are some of the priorities or goals that you and maybe the elected officials or the community have for North Canton specifically? Are there things that you're working to try to achieve?
Yeah. And if I recall, in one of our previous discussions, you were asking me about kind of working in a strong mayor system
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
contrasting that with a city manager. And now I've actually had a chance to experience the other system, which is kind of like I thought before, where I think, the challenges and opportunities are pretty similar in either system. I think, the role of the administrator, because we have a part-time mayor in North Canton, it is a lot stronger. And so that's been kind of an interesting contrast. But I'd say as far as our priorities, we have really solid residential. Like I mentioned, the housing market is strong. So it doesn't need a lot of, it certainly doesn't need like triage or a lot of super hands-on attention from the city. We're kind of trying to manage and maintain what we have. I think on the commercial and industrial side, Diebold is our largest employer. They have close to 1,000 employees. It's actually their world headquarters, and it's Diebold Nixdorf is the corporation, and they have a pretty big presence in Germany. That's the Nixdorf side of it. So we actually do get people flying in from Germany to go to training and stuff like that. So it's nice kind of having a large legacy employer. We're also the home of Walsh University, which is a small but very great Catholic university. So that's another stable and strong employer for the community. I think what we're really focusing on is like we've got a lot of good small businesses, but our main street, which is full of activity, but although I think like in urban form, it is set up to be walkable, it's still kind of built on like a fairly suburban pattern where it like looks more walkable than it really is when you're out there walking around. So we are kind of working right now on a Main Street initiative to try to get a critical mass of smaller businesses in our downtown. And then as a legacy of that, the Hoover Company, Diebold occupies a lot of the old Hoover buildings, but there's a building called the West Factory, which is a 500,000 square foot brick building with a smokestack that says Hoover. It's their original plant. Industrial Realty Group, which is a big buyer nationwide, has done a lot of work in Northeast Ohio of old industrial properties and turned them into apartments and retail, owns that building. We've got a TIF with them. The community and IRG have been working for years to try to get about 226 new apartments into that old factory with some retail. The market, those apartments, if they existed, would be rented immediately. It's more just in this lending environment and this inflationary environment, it's been hard for the developer to make the numbers work. But that's about a 10-acre site and, like I said, 500,000 square feet. So if we're able to get that redeveloped, that would be a real game changer for our downtown.
Yeah, that's great. I can picture that. I'll have to look it up and see the actual images, but I can imagine what's that like. So, one of the things that, and this may be an interesting contrast for you when we talk about the housing stock, you had this recent post where you shared some thoughts about like older homes and older housing stock. And we have this kind of romantic notion of older homes, and it's wonderful to have such a great stock of older houses. But I guess you've seen sort of two sides of that coin with your time in Akron and your time now in North Canton, which probably has a somewhat older housing stock by today's standards too. But a stronger housing market versus a weaker housing market. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because I guess it struck me that you brought up some things that I think a lot of people don't really think about when they think about housing, and I have thought about this too, because I have probably said to people, "Oh, look at this community. Has wonderful, beautiful old homes, and you could buy one for like 20 grand and fix it up." But you really push back on that notion. I wonder if we could talk just a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I don't know if I need to say it, but just to put my urban planner bona fides on the table. I do love older houses. I've got a house that'll turn 80 next year.
Mm-hmm.
And so it definitely, I wasn't trying to throw shade on older housing. But as you mentioned, I do think that sometimes maybe people romanticize it to a fault. And in particular, I think sometimes they romanticize it in like weak market cities. So, if you're in San Francisco or Brooklyn, there's a lot of housing stock from the 19th century, and certainly from the early 20th century. And that housing just commands extremely high prices. They have the opposite problem. It is too expensive, although there's still no shortage of people who will pay for it because they're, global markets in very attractive cities. But in a place like Akron or Canton or Cleveland, I would imagine a lot of Kansas City too, in the inner neighborhoods, depending on the neighborhood. If you're in a fairly strong neighborhood, then say you buy a fixer-upper that's old, you're probably going to get your money back, or at least you're going to you're not going to be throwing your money away. You'll feel good about your investment, and particularly if you plan on living there for a long time, it's probably something that makes a lot of sense. But a lot of our Rust Belt cities, you can have houses that are nominally extremely affordable, $20,000, $40,000, $50,000, but the amount of money you have to put in just to make it habitable, and then to go beyond making it habitable and actually to make it a place you would really want to live and be excited about living. I mean, you could end up putting, 5 times the value of the house into it. And, if you're truly willing to just stay there for the long haul, that could still make sense. But I mentioned an example. I shared an old blog post, article, and mentioned an example of, I remember when I was planning director in Akron, a lot of people would come to me and say, well, why can't you guys have one of those programs where college students can just buy an old house for $1? Which, I mean, at first glance sounds like a great idea. They need a house. Mm-hmm. The house is available. It truly might be something you could sell for $1. Although when I say you could, who that actually is that owns the house and is selling it is a important question. But, does that young person either have the know-how to do it themselves and the time, even if they have the know-how, or just the money to actually put into not just upgrading the house, but also maintaining it day to day. So I guess in conclusion, new old houses are great. I think we do need more incentives and both like social and economic incentives to rehabilitate old homes. But there are some market reasons, I think, that people do like new homes in some cases, and why new homes keep getting a lot of market share in most markets.
Yeah, and I think from like a personal experience, I remember, so the first house I bought was a 100-year-old property. That was actually an old home that had been carved up into 3 apartments. And so I lived in one and rented out the other 2. And I used that money to not only just pay the mortgage, but also help improve the house. But like a lot of older homes, it had a ton of needs. And some of those needs were really expensive. Some of those things were things that I could do myself. And I spent a lot of time. I actually rewired a lot of the house myself, which I probably shouldn't admit on a podcast, but I did it anyway. Did a lot of plumbing work myself and other things. And I enjoyed it. It was fun. And ultimately, when I came to sell it, I was able to get my money out of it because it was in a solid neighborhood. But it was not easy or cheap necessarily because of all that extra investment that I had to put into it. But one thing I remember when I sold that house, I moved into a new house that I built just maybe a quarter mile away, where I'd found an empty lot, and I had designed a house and had it built from brand new from the ground up, and a new home sort of built to look like the older homes in the area. And one of the one of the quickest things that I noticed upon moving in was how much cheaper my utility bill was for a fairly similar sized house. And I didn't do anything particularly innovative in terms of the construction. It was just new construction with, a concrete basement, 2x6 walls, insulation, new windows, and my utility bills were half what they'd been at the other house. And it kind of, I think about that because it thinks about like what you were talking about when you start looking at the total cost of a house, and there are a lot of traps when you think about older homes if you're not really thinking about the whole picture of what goes out every month.
Yeah, and you just kind of reminded me of another thing. My wife and I have this conversation a lot. We have some friends that lived in our neighborhood and they upgraded to a much larger house in a nearby suburb. And, the new house objectively, in many respects, is a great house. It's much larger. It's kind of got all the modern design features, the big open floor plan with the kitchen island and the giant great room and, the kitchen with all the bells and whistles. And, it's a nice living space and, pretty well done for a suburban development, just in terms of the context. But where my wife and I will kind of compare a lot, with our house and with our friends' old houses, our house is extremely solid. There's plaster, there's hardwood floors. A lot of these newer homes, you could just easily punch through the drywall. I do wonder sometimes, even with the high prices they command, when the patina of newness eventually wears off, like, are these houses really going to last the test of, stand the test of time, just from a standpoint of just the building materials and the way they're constructed? And it just always makes me think about, how were we as a society able to build these really solid homes that truly working class people were able to afford? And, of course, if you were like a factory worker, you weren't buying the same house that the guy that owned the factory did, but you probably did, if you had like a good union job, have a very solid, attractive, nice place to live. And it does seem like that is increasingly getting away from people. I mean, I'm sure you've listened to the same podcasts or read the same articles about like Gen Z in particular, and just the extreme difficulty of even breaking into the housing market, and people who are even coming out of college with pretty good jobs who are despairing that they'll ever actually be able to buy a house. And it is one of those, I think, big economic and social questions that increasingly, I think, is insisting upon being heard, because, the housing market, I think, really is not working for a lot of people right now.
Yeah. So, I've got a podcast I think I may release next week or so, where I've got some thoughts about, finding some of these communities that really are overlooked gems, and thinking about how younger people could move there and buy property, et cetera. And I'm sure a lot of Northeast Ohio is like that. When you think about that idea and you confront it with the reality of how challenging some of the older properties can be, how do you think about that? Do you think about like, okay, well, this is a positive. There really is still opportunity in these places, and there still is a good quality of life. But as somebody who thinks about what your community might do to create an incentive for people to take up that offer, how do you think about what could be done, or what are the opportunities?
Yeah, like when I think about, that's a great question. When I think about Northeast Ohio in particular, I mean, the diversity of housing stock and types of communities. I mean, I think there are a lot of other older regions of the United States that would be directly comparable to this, with the exception of the price point. There is a tremendous variety of houses here. Everything from stuff from the 19th century to bungalows to kind of typical frame homes with a nice front porch. to Cape Cods and colonials in the 40s and 50s, to all sorts of, to ranches, to split levels, newer suburban housing. And although every part of America has some combination of those types of homes in different environments, whether it's, urban core, kind of inner ring, or suburban or exurban, our region, and I think a lot of regions like it, really has a rich variety of housing and different types of communities. And I think what sets us apart, including, cities like Detroit or Milwaukee or, Kansas City or a lot of the Midwest, is it isn't, out of sight expensive. Like Northern New Jersey has that same variety of homes, but, good luck affording almost any of them for a lot of people. And so I think, in our region, it's not so much a matter that there aren't homes available for buyers. Here, younger people are generally able to buy homes, especially if they have a decent job. But I think there is that big supply and demand mismatch, across the whole country, that as people have discussed for, years now, there are a lot of the places that people are still trying to move, understandably, for jobs and so forth, are the most expensive cities. And then a lot of the more affordable places where it is in the cards for you to buy a home on a $50,000 or $60,000 a year salary, they're just places that people, aren't interested in moving to, either because of the job situation or the weather or whatever their reason is. But I think that supply and demand mismatch across the whole country continues to be a big challenge.
So what do you think about then as some of the tools to attract people to think about Rust Belt cities in particular? What is the pitch to, let's say, the 28-year-old living in Brooklyn with all the dynamism that exists in a place like that, but also there's so much that's out of reach for somebody in that scenario?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I know you and I have talked in the past about, Richard Florida and the creative class idea. And, I was always a little bit of a skeptic of that, even when it was very au courant. But I don't think it was a crazy idea. I think that trend of people, picking a place first and then kind of finding a job, it's not that didn't happen or that wasn't real, but I do think that, especially with the passage of time, that's a little bit overblown, and maybe a lot of chambers of commerce or just, the intelligentsia of these various metropolitan areas who do tend to kind of latch on to the current thing, I think emphasize that more than reality would reflect. I guess what I'm getting at is I do think people still need a job. I'm sure there are people out there who just move somewhere and then just figure that they'll find a job. But I do think most people still they want to have a job in a field that they lined up before they move. And so I do think in the Rust Belt in particular, the job situation, I do think is the number one thing to try to solve for in terms of attracting people back to these regions. And I was just in a conversation the other day with our Stark County, which is the county that North Canton's in, our Stark Economic Development Board, which is our countywide economic development organization. And they have a big housing study that they completed about a year and a half ago, talking about, impediments to people living in our region and what the housing stock is like. And I thought it was really great because I think for a long time, the economic development discussion and the housing discussion were completely segregated into different buckets. And I think the reality is there is a ton of synergy between the two of those that you really do need. You kind of need to have the jobs and economic health part, firing on more cylinders to get people to move to your region. But you also have to have the housing equation worked out too. So I do think, though, I guess coming full circle, that in our region in the Rust Belt, the jobs part is probably the prerequisite to getting people to come back.
Yeah. It's also interesting just thinking about, I had one of the conversations I had recently with a guy named Justin Prajant, who lives in Atchison, Kansas, which is a place that most people wouldn't be able to find on a map, but little town, northeast Kansas, and he sort of became a developer and is trying to do projects in his town and other rural areas of Kansas. And one of the things we talked about is like, even because I think I'd asked him a question about, how does he think about doing development in a place that's not, growing necessarily from a population standpoint. Now Atchison in the micro case of Atchison, it's starting to grow. It's been growing a little bit, but this is by almost every measure, a very small town. And we had a good chat about that. And really, I think if I were to summarize one thing, it would be, people in his market want and deserve nice things too, even if the place isn't necessarily growing per se, that there's still a market for nice things. And in his case, that meant nicer, better housing options. And so he set about to do some of that, where he can, and projects that he can control. And I wonder if how that kind of strikes you, also in a region with, not really population growth per se, but there's still people there that are going to work every day, that they have jobs, there's money, and they also want to have those sorts of nice things. And how do you think about that from like a planning and development standpoint?
Yeah, I think maybe that gets into just like some of the mega trends that are related to. I remember really taking a lot out of your podcast on the vibe shift in cities and just in general. And I do think like part of that vibe shift, just as far as like, macro trends in the country, is that I think in a lot of ways, like our era of chasing growth is really coming to an end. That, the population, even nationwide, especially when you look at the birth rate and so forth, it's below replacement level. I mean, as everybody listening to this knows, that, as we record this, there is a ton of acrimony and political dispute over immigration, but assuming that immigration is curtailed significantly, I mean, that has been the source of most of the growth in the United States population for decades. And, assuming, which I don't think is far-fetched, that we get into a scenario where the country is actually not growing at all, there's going to be less growth to go around. And I think that does get to, well, how do places still remain viable and plan for the people who are there? Because I think it's part of the American psyche that we do almost fetishize growth in this country. And I mean, I understand why. I mean, I want growth for my community, both where I work and where I live as well. But I do think that does sometimes distract people in leadership roles from just serving the people who are already there and focusing on quality of life. I mean, that's another thing I love about working in North Canton and in a smaller city, that a lot of, both because of our budget and our capacity, which we do a lot with the team that we have, we really are focused very heavily on quality of life, like making sure the snow's plowed, making sure that people have great streets in terms of just, keeping them in a good state of repair, making sure that we strictly enforce our housing code and our building code and so forth. And we have great schools. So like a lot of that, one thing that people will say about North Canton, for example, is it's a great place to live. It's extremely safe. And it has really good services. And I do think sometimes in the the economic development discussion or looking at like the next shiny new thing. Like not that you shouldn't reach for the stars or have higher aspirations, but I think meeting those day-to-day needs of safety and stability for residents is really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's foundational, it seems like, for every place. That like if you don't focus on some of these things, then people will find their focus elsewhere, and maybe you may find people moving to another place. I kind of want to get a little. I don't want to get, I guess, esoteric, but this conversation kind of makes me think. Because you hit on like one of the big topics of concern in some portions of day-to-day conversation, which is population decline. And there's a big conversation happening now about the low birth rate, not just in the United States, but almost all over the world. And to the extremes where like South Korea is vastly below replacement rate at 0.7 births per woman, I believe. And in the U.S., we're now below it as a country, and it's better or worse in certain places. And you and I were born in the baby bust era. We're Gen Xers, and so we were part of that original baby bust. The birth rate did recover after us and go back up, not to the level of the baby boom in terms of the babies per person, but it went back up. And it's come back down again. And it's interesting because there's a lot of people who kind of shrug at this topic and think it's not really that big. It's not a big deal. Maybe there's too many people on the planet anyway, competing for too few resources, whatever. But you're kind of on the front lines of a place where you've seen population decline. And how do you think that impacts the psyche of people and communities? I wonder a lot about this because I think people tend to minimize what impact it has if you're living in a place where the population is growing versus when the population is declining. And there's so many impacts to that a lot of us don't think about who aren't living in a place where that's happening.
Yeah, that's a extremely interesting topic. And like you said, a very important topic. And as you said as well, I mean, it is increasingly a worldwide topic. I mean, I've read some population projections even on China, that I've seen ones where, I think they're around 1.4, 1.5 billion, with them going to 700 some million, in the next 80 years. And who knows whether that will pan out exactly as that. But, if you do have a birth dearth for a protracted period of time, I mean, you are almost guaranteed just by the laws of, statistics to have a lot less people in the future, barring, massive immigration or something like that. And when I think about it, I think of I think losing population for all the reasons you said, psychologically, maybe even spiritually in a certain way, is a difficult thing for people to reckon with, and is kind of damaging to their self-image or their psyche. But I think, especially in a Rust Belt context, I think our population loss in particular was very damaging because it wasn't just kind of a slow progression of a lower birth rate, which I think still has plenty of challenges of its own, but it was in, direct relation to massive structural economic change, the closure of, hundreds of factories, the disintegration of tens of thousands of good union jobs. And, behind each one of those paychecks was typically a family that depended on that. And, many of those people, when they lost their job, I know at least here in Akron, many people moved to the South. Like a lot of the first wave of the decline of the rubber industry was the relocation of plants to South Carolina or Tennessee or Oklahoma or Texas. A lot of people followed those jobs. Similarly, a lot of people stayed around but moved to the suburbs. And like I've written about and like we've talked about, that kind of results in this like vicious cycle of, tax bases hurt, school enrollment is hurt. There's less people to pay for the same amount of stuff in terms of infrastructure. There's less people to probably pay for even more problems, that result when the city loses a lot of people. And so that's pretty well documented, I think, like what happens in Detroit or Cleveland or Youngstown or Flint when, you lose 50, 60, 70% of your population. But it will be interesting to see like just what happens in the country in general. Like if, the United States starts to actually lose population, which it is probably almost certain to do at some point in the future, because, so much of our like national self-image is continual growth and continual economic growth and pushing to the next frontier. And I've read some stuff even just about, with the closing of the frontier, quote unquote, that like, for the last 80, 100 years, like, that was such a big part of the American identity. And, the whole country's settled now. And, people were continuing to fill in all the places without enough water in the West. But, so yeah, I mean, I do think, I definitely don't have a lot of, predictions on exactly what will happen. But I think like you're getting at, a lot of people sense that at the least, that's going to be a big change that's going to be challenging for people to wrap their heads around.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much of what we do in our world and planning and development in particular that has a baseline assumption of a place growing, or at least maintaining, right? Not losing population. I mean, that's something I think about a lot because we have all of these policy discussions and there's so many of them that revolve around, there's like a baked in assumption that the place is going to grow. But if we have a 10 or 20 year or 30 year long baby bust, there is a point where you really, and sooner than people realize, where you start to feel that. I guess the schools feel it first because kids are 5 years old, they're getting ready to go to kindergarten. But I think even on the housing demand side, you can start to see that sooner than people realize. It's funny because there's this context, especially like in the YIMBY world, and with the YIMBY world, I'm very sympathetic to in many, many respects, in most respects. But there's also this baseline assumption that we're always going to have this strong housing demand. Because population is going to keep growing in a lot of places, but that may not be the case. And what's that going to do to people's psyches and mentalities for when they think about their communities if it's all of a sudden like, oh crap, we're facing decline?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that makes me think about, especially in this role as being a city administrator, is in Ohio in particular, and I think a lot of the Midwest, and it's probably largely this way in Missouri, we have a lot of local governments. There are a lot of townships and a lot of villages and a lot of cities. And, they all have their own fiefdoms to one degree or another. And there's good, there's historical reasons going back to when the land was surveyed, right after the Revolutionary War in the case of where I live. And, but over time, there's a lot of police chiefs and a lot of fire chiefs and just to use my own profession, a lot of city administrators and school superintendents. And I'm not predicting that we're going to get countywide consolidations, or because there is a strong tradition in a lot of the Midwest, especially in local government. And local government that's closer to the people, I do think generally can be good. It has trade-offs like everything else, but I do think as like the pie shrinks or the population shrinks, there are going to be more and more small townships or villages that just like literally can't afford to provide certain services anymore. And I do think that we're going to be in a situation where you're going to see consolidations. Another dynamic I've thought about or just noticed is it's kind of like a bipartisan, there's bipartisan resistance to it too, because, like Republicans will generally, say that local government is good, the more governments, the better. But also generally, at least, as part of their platform, say they want to be fiscally responsible, which would sometimes lead toward maybe being a champion for consolidating things. But those two priorities kind of clash. And then on the Democrat side, people will talk about, maybe it's important to consolidate and have larger governments, but then, especially in central cities, Democrats stand to lose political power. Like if you picture, Akron is 13 people on city council, they're all Democrats. Like if it were to consolidate with a lot of suburbs, maybe you have a city council that's, 8 Democrats and 5 Republicans. And so there starts to be a disincentive for them to, consolidate things too. So it's going to be an interesting dynamic moving forward, as kind of the economics and the costs of government point in one direction, but a lot of our, political entrenched interests maybe point in the other.
Yeah. Yeah. I still feel like sometimes we're wrestling with the world that the boomers made. And I'm not dragging on the boomers here. They were a very, very large and influential generation, but we're still very much exist in the boomers world, and we're trying to figure out how to transition out of it. And there's a lot that was really built and made for that generation that doesn't really work terribly well anymore, and we've got to figure out how to change. I do want to. You touched on something there I want to expand on a little bit. So now you've had this opportunity of you're working in a smaller city. You said about 17,000 people, I think. Versus Akron, which was a larger city. And that conversation that we've had before about the difference, between, larger and smaller jurisdictions and the ability to focus more, more specifically at a local level in a smaller versus a larger jurisdiction. And just, how administration happens is really fascinating to me. And it's a rabbit hole I've gone down a lot, but I'm curious how you see that on the ground now, kind of, working in a smaller community versus working in a larger one.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Like, North Canton is roughly a tenth of the size of Akron. Akron's around 190,000 population. Like you said, North Canton, 17,000. Even in land area, Akron's like 62 square miles and North Canton 6 square miles. So it's about a tenth smaller in that regard too. And, one thing I've noticed being in a smaller city is, and I mean, I have the utmost respect and great fondness for all my former colleagues in Akron. So they do a great job. They work together great. But I think it's just the nature of the beast. Like in a place like North Canton, people wear a lot more hats. So, it just can't be as specialized or departmentalized as like a larger city. And so, although that can be a challenge because you have a smaller budget, North Canton has a 2% income tax. Akron has a 2.5% income tax. But then Akron has a lot of challenges that North Canton doesn't have, too. Which necessitates, for example, like a per capita larger police force or more funding for older infrastructure for demolishing houses or what have you. But I think in a smaller place, I think I'm really impressed in North Canton with just the ability of all of our team to kind of multitask and know a little bit about a lot of things. And it's also put me a lot closer to the people who are doing the day-to-day work of turning valves to shut off like water main breaks or plow snow or provide water. And it is, I think, in a smaller place, like you can be a lot closer to the challenges that residents face and you have a little more capacity to help them. Like, our culture in North Canton is that, we have people that just walk up to the counter in City Hall and like say, this is my challenge. And like, we help them, right there. Like in Akron, it just wouldn't be as feasible. It's just like a larger city, and Akron's got a good 311 system. If you have a pothole or they didn't pick up your trash or, your trash cart broke a wheel or whatever it is, you can call in. But I think just our ability by virtue of size to be closer to the day-to-day needs of the population, it is pretty fulfilling to be able to like get to know people individually and help them.
Yeah, it seems like it's like this balance between, efficiency, which, we're kind of taught that efficiency happens in larger units. But there's also the need for, accessibility, transparency. Who do I call? Who do I talk to? Do I know the person who works in my city government? Do I know who the codes inspector is? Can I find somebody that can help me out if I have a problem? And I just feel like there's a lot to be said for those smaller units. And it still makes me realize it makes me think about, my city is about 500,000 people, a city of Akron that's, almost 200,000. Are there ways to administrate, do the same sort of administration, but at a smaller unit within city government that is more multidisciplinary, like you're experiencing? So, we've chatted a bit about this, but now that you have the direct experience, do you feel like this holds any water?
Yeah, I do think that's a really interesting idea. And I would think about that when I was planning director and I was in the mayor's cabinet. So I would be in on, kind of strategic discussions about delivering services to residents. And, I always kind of tried to conceptualize in my own head what it might be like to, even within Akron, which is still, there are a lot of cities larger than Akron, but, a lot of places that are smaller, of course, as well, would like some sort of neighborhood based service delivery make sense? Or, we had a lot of discussions in Akron, for example. There's one police station. It's not, we've never had precincts. We've never had, there was some community type policing done, but, would it be better? There was a big conversation, which is still, working its way through in Akron about renovating the police station, which is going forward. It's about a $50 million project. But I remember when I was in the cabinet working for the mayor, we did talk about, would it make more sense to have precincts, and to have smaller police stations, probably still have some sort of, nerve center and central station. But, police is just one service amongst many. Fire department for response time, there are, Akron has around 16, 17 fire stations. Like in North Canton, we have 2. We're actually building one to replace both of them right now. But, some of those services are somewhat out in the different neighborhoods, especially in a larger city like Akron. But it would be interesting to explore models where, maybe you even have like, building officials or other types of services that the city provides more at the neighborhood level. But I think that does happen a little bit more somewhere like New York, just because the scale is so large. I know, each of the boroughs kind of have their own, administrative people and so forth. But probably something that we'll be thinking about as a country a lot more in the future.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to think about reinventing a lot of these models. There's a lot of frustration across the spectrum about, what a lot of local and state and federal government, even what they're delivering and, and how they're delivering it. And we're a lot of places are still operating off models that we set up, 100 years ago. And it's a good time to ask those questions. I think about this, in my world, people talk in my city in particular a lot about problems with permitting. And it's just like a never ending source of frustration and conversation for developers and builders with, our city about, permitting and inspections. It's such a nightmare, blah, blah, blah. And as we dial it in, I just wonder if I just can't help but think is part of the problem it's the structure of how we've created these departments that become little silos. The silos are just get bigger and bigger, and we've got people who don't really talk to each other or communicate with each other very well because the departments themselves become kind of insular as they get bigger. And if there was a way to break that down a little bit more, to a model of 20, 25,000 people in an area, and I go to my district, municipal office, and I know who the code review is. That person is there, and the inspection guy, and they work out of that area. It just might have a whole different approach, even though maybe that ends up being more expensive for local government to deliver. I don't know, but it just seems like it might be a better way. So that's my rant.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I was mentioning consolidations of governments before, but I do feel like we're kind of at this crossroads where maybe there are some services that government provides that lend themselves to a larger scale in consolidating things to save administrative costs. But like you just said, maybe other services that, should be subdivided into smaller, service delivery units almost. And I do think we're, like we've talked a little bit before about generations and the fourth turning and things like that. I mean, I think the country in a lot of respects from the municipal level on up is going to be really different 20 years from now. That I think there's a lot of, challenges that we've just kind of kicked the can on that are just coming to a head all at once. I think that's why, I've heard from many people just in my personal life, like, just things seem so different than when I was growing up, or like just it's so crazy right now. And I do think it's because we are going through, a significant every, 80, 100 years change, that I do think we will come out in the end out of it and find new ways forward. But it's a pretty disruptive and challenging time to be working through all this stuff right now.
Yeah, to say the least. There's a lot of disruption going on, and there's going to be things people like and things people don't like. But it's, I think of it in sort of those fourth turning terms as well. And I probably, in my mental framework, kind of pin things back 100 years in the past when we changed more about American society in the 19 teens and 20s than most people realize today, just because there's very few people alive still from that era. And so there's not as much of a memory of what changed or what it was like before then. And it's entirely likely we're going through a similar sort of period now that's going. And by the way, when that happened in the teens and 20s, there was a lot of physical violence and disruption. And, if you want to read about the history of the anarchists and, all the assassinations that happened all over the world in that era is pretty wild. So it's sometimes these things get ugly, and it's seems to be part of our human nature, for better or worse.
Yeah, a lot of parallels to that time, I think, in all the aspects that you're talking about.
Yeah, so no happy spin I can put on that at the moment, other than, I do think, I do tend to agree that I think 20 years from now, things will be really different. And I am somebody who I think it's smart to bet on that America will figure it out. I think free societies eventually figure it out. And people coalesce on a different path, but you can also have these really disruptive time periods. Jason, we're at about an hour, I feel like I should probably mind our time. As I wrap up here, is there anything that you would like to share, or anything you would like to point people to keep up with you?
Yeah, I appreciate, as always, being a guest. It's always really awesome to have these conversations and discussions. I don't really have anything to, any wares to hawk or anything like that.
Yeah,
Or I am still, I think we talked last time, I am working on trying to get a Substack stood up and trying to work that into my busy schedule, and starting to try to get into writing a little bit more. I've been trying to do that a little bit on LinkedIn, just as I have time. But I'm hoping, in the next year or so, to be able to start, blogging and writing a little bit more. Taking a break from it, I think, has been really good. And I kind of feel like there's been so many discussions of so many things. I felt like I was going to sit back and just kind of listen and absorb what's out there. And, like a lot of people, this has been a crazy 5 years. I mean, I think we're probably in for another crazy 5 years. But
yeah,
like you said, I would echo what you said. I mean, I do have a lot of confidence in the end that we will figure it out. We'll work our way through. I think in a lot of moments of intense historic change, people get frustrated because they can't see the future. But I mean, I would argue we can never really see the future, and it's
yeah,
just in
right.
disruptive times and challenging times that we think about it more. But I mean, it's hard for me to take my own advice sometime, but I think living one day at a time is a pretty good way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And focus on what matters that's closest to you. So,
Right.
Well, Jason Segedy, thanks so much for joining the show. It's great to talk to you again, as always. And I hope you have a great 2026.
Thank you, Kevin. You too.
All right. Take care.